Welcome back to Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel on 9 PBS. Clarity, understanding, and empathy. Common values for those on the front lines charting a bold way forward for African Americans in St. Louis. Stay tuned as we talk to these changemakers, visionaries, and overcomers. I'll ask the questions you want to hear and get the clarity we all need about the issues we face. That's next on Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel on 9 PBS. Coming up next on Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel, we start Season 2 with a look at the impact of the Great Migration on St. Louis. Beginning in 1910, 6 million African Americans would leave the discrimination and violence of the Jim Crow South and head to the North, the West, and the Midwest. Dr. Henry Louis Gates is chronicling this historic population shift on PBS in his 4-part documentary, The Great Migration, A People on the Move. Joining me next is Dr. Priscilla Dowden-White, Associate Professor of History at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. She says the consequences of the Great Migration in the Gateway City would be felt nationwide. That's next on Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel on 9 PBS.
Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel is supported in part by Midwest Bank Center, the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation, and Orvin and Latrice Kimbrough.
Welcome back to another episode of Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to those who have come new subscribers in our Season 2 broadcast. We appreciate your support. We appreciate that so much. Also, your comments are incredible. We love it when you watch the show, listen to the show, and just let us know what you thought. A lot of you share as well. We encourage you to do that, to share these great conversations. And like the podcast, you just click that like button, very easy to do. And the bell, I'm giving you all kinds of instructions. I apologize, but I have to. It's part of my job. Click the bell, and then you get alerted when new podcasts drop. So welcome again to Season 2 of Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel. New set, new furniture, but a guest who's been here before. Absolutely. Welcome back, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be back.
The book is called Groping Toward Democracy, African American Social Welfare Reform in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. Is this your only book, or have you written more than one? Yes, this is my only
book. I'm working on a second book
now. I thought
Mm-hmm.
so. Groping Toward Democracy. We'll talk about your book a little bit because it does include some of the topics we'll discuss today. But can we get the shoe cam? Simon said he could get the shoe cam going. Yeah. Oh, yeah, Professor. You don't walk in here into this brand new studio with these fantastic cowboy boots.
I get more compliments off of these boots.
It's the color combination. It's the caramel and the dark brown. It's the color combo. But the pandemic changed a lot of us in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And apparently you developed a love of cowboy boots.
Yes.
Not even our topic today. I promise you it is not what we were going to discuss. My husband said when, of course, everybody's shopping online during the pandemic, and he said, "You mean to tell me that I never need to go in a store again?" He loves it because he does not like shopping in the store, doesn't like shopping at all. But it also was very easy. I can admit to you, Professor, that I remember falling asleep with my phone in my hand and the thumb hitting the buy. Yeah.
Well, did you ever wake up the next morning and didn't realize that you had bought something?
That's the story I just told you. Yes. No. I fell asleep, the thumb hit buy. I woke up the next morning. I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I buy? Yeah. So watch out filling up that cart. So she has more than one pair of cowboy boots.
We'll just leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that. So I asked you to come because there's this wonderful series on PBS right now. Mm-hmm. Skip Gates is whatever he does, I'm watching. Mm-hmm. I am watching, and this is about the Great Migration, and it is a 4-part series. And the question is, did the Great Migration impact St. Louis? Because we look at African Americans leaving the South, leaving Jim Crow, leaving the violence, leaving the oppression to go north. But did they stop in St. Louis?
Absolutely. St. Louis was a major center of in-migration during the first half of the 20th century. And that's that includes everyone, all groups. It was a major center for in-migration, but in particular for African Americans. And when we look at the census records, they tell the story in part just through looking at the numbers before we start getting into, what the impact was in terms of community building and institution building
And culture.
And that type of thing. We really just need to also go back to the Exodusters migration in the 1880s, late 1870s, right after Reconstruction, because the Black population in St. Louis went from just over about 3,200 to well over 22,000 from the 1860, 1870, 1880 census. So there was a sizable population here when when the Great Migration really takes off. And of course, during Reconstruction, Sumner High School was established. And as you know, Sumner is going to play a major role in attracting migrants who want to make sure that their children receive an education. And so when we look nationwide and when we look at the South in particular, Sumner High School in St. Louis and Sumner High School in Washington, D.C. are the two oldest high schools with a comprehensive curriculum. And Sumner in St. Louis is the oldest west of the Mississippi, of course. And so when we get to the turn of the century, you can already start to see that something is happening, not only in terms of the numbers of migrants who are coming in, but we're seeing a shift taking place even in race relations. So the late 1800s, early 1900s, this is the progressive era, the progressive movement. So progressive reformers, not just in St. Louis, but cities, nationwide, are interested in reforms of all types, but they are in particular those who are interested in African Americans. They are interested in surveying what opportunities, for example, in St. Louis, what opportunities are available, accessible to African Americans at that time. What institutions, what resources are African Americans locked out of because of segregation?
Which is plentiful.
And we have to, take into account that just a few years earlier, in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson, which is commonly known as the separate but equal ruling. And so this separate but equal ruling did not serve to create segregation, but it served to create a legal foundation and a way for not only the pro-segregationist, but also African Americans who do not believe in segregation in principle, but they have to find a way to navigate during this most entrenched period of racial segregation. Because when we look at 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. And then we come up to Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which declares that the public schools have to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And it does not just apply to the schools. We see the walls, the institutional walls of racial segregation starting to collapse at that point. In between those Supreme Court cases is that first half of the 20th century. And so African Americans, again, have to figure out a way to progress during this most entrenched period of racial segregation.
And that's not just surviving.
It's not just surviving.
We want to thrive.
We want to thrive. And in the 1930s, W.B. Du Bois, who was one of the founding members, as you know, of the NAACP, he got in some hot water with the NAACP during those years. And actually, it was during that time when he resigned as the editor of the Crisis magazine. There was a big schism within the NAACP. Du Bois had written a series of 3 articles in the Crises, and they became known as the segregation pieces, the segregation articles, where he argued that because racial segregation was so firmly rooted, and because there were no signs that
it was being uprooted,
and that the country was going to, the nation was going to get on a path of integration. Du Bois argued in the early 30s that African Americans needed to use segregation, transmute it into power. Those were the words that he used. Transmute segregation into power. Now, he wasn't the first one to come up with that idea, because we can look back at Booker T. Washington,
right,
who actually kind of perfected that idea.
And he wasn't the only one who felt this way.
Absolutely. And so, again, African Americans at this time were not accepting racial segregation in principle. But as Du Bois said, you have to use it to transmute it into power. And in my work, in my book, I also look at how African Americans in St. Louis are doing just that. And I refer to it as the manipulation of public culture. Because in St. Louis, what we find that is pretty extraordinary. When we talk about the establishment, the opening of Homer G. Phillips Hospital, for example, which, as you know, became nationally recognized, nationally known as a training center for Black doctors and
excellence.
And excellence. And although that's kind of a complicated story, because, and I don't want to get off on that right now, but yes, they did become known for excellence. But we can talk about that a little later if it comes back up. But the establishment of Homer G. Phillips Hospital, in a sense, is the product of the Great Migration. And even though Sumner High School had been established during the Reconstruction era, its third and current location opened in the academic school year of 1910-1911. So this is at the beginning of the Great Migration.
The first wave.
Yes. And so we wouldn't have even seen this third location if the impact
had not been great.
It had not been great.
And this supports or is playing out what W.B. Du Bois was saying.
Yes.
We were turning this movement and going where we were going and entrenching ourselves in our own power.
Yes.
And developing our own institutions.
Yes. And so, over the years, I've had students, when we talk about these things in courses, and we talk about this period, and they see African Americans actually advocating to create segregated institutions. At first, some of them are like, why would Black people want to support racial segregation? Well, they're not supporting it in principle, but they are living in a society. This is a context where racial segregation is entrenched.
It's in the law.
It's in the law. Popular opinion, and the crossing it can put one in danger. Did put many in danger, and so you're living this life. And while I'm over here, I'm going to do for myself. Yes, and part of what makes St. Louis an attractive center for Black migrants, and a major part of why we're able to see African Americans transmuting segregation into power, is because African Americans here had the vote. They had the franchise. And so they never, when during the Civil War era amendments, when Black men were able to vote with the 15th Amendment, at that time, of course, women were not able to vote, but women were at the same time politically active. So I might not be able to vote, but I can still support that. I can still support the vote and getting
policy
the vote out, and policy and all of those things. So I can be active politically on a larger scale, even though I'm not able to vote. Well, what happens 1920, and women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And so now, and again, we're in the midst of what we're now able to see. It had already occurred. It had already started, but now we're really starting to see the impact of the Great Migration. And so the vote becomes very important to African Americans' mobility in St. Louis and their ability to make their voices heard and to advocate for institutions that would serve them. That would serve them.
I'm curious, because when we talk about the Great Migration, and this is what is so beautiful about the documentary that Professor Gates has put together, we just talk about often just the movement of it, because it is the greatest historic movement of people in terms of numbers, from one place to another in this country. So we talk about the physical. We see the photos and cars, and people are dressed. They're in trains, making this move. They've piled up everything they have in those old suitcases, and they're making this move physically. But I've often wondered, how did you choose where to go, and who was ahead of you telling you, and what were they saying? Come to Detroit, come to Chicago, come to St. Louis, come to Seattle, which we know why. We understand why Portland, Seattle, the naval shipyards, that's what drew so many African Americans there. But I've always been so curious, who was saying what and how to get. You come here because it's great here.
Well, the newspapers, as you know.
Which, can I stop you and say,
yes.
Do not lose that train of thought, Professor, because we had Dr. Donald Suggs on the first season of this podcast, and we were talking about the Black press. And people would be shocked to know at one time there were over 300 Black newspapers in this country. And so that's how that one way in which that word was getting out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as I'm sure you're aware, many of these migrants, they had connections in these various cities before they came. There were some that just ventured out and said, I don't know what I'm going to find there. I don't know anyone there. But most had connections here,
Yeah.
family or friends, and so that was very important. St. Louis, has been historically, it's because of where it's located, and it's always had a mixture of, and now I'm talking about all migrants, not just African American migrants, but it's had a mixture of migrants that have come from different regions. And what is important there to think about for the African American community and the Great Migration during this period is that you had white St. Louisans who had come from the Northeast. They came from other places as well, but some who had come from that abolitionist tradition. So that's very important because they have not only an openness, but they have a desire to work on reforms.
Right, and help
that
the
will
formerly enslaved.
Absolutely. And now we're talking about the 20th century,
Right.
and they're coming from that tradition. You also have white Southerners who are here in St. Louis, and those things that we associate with the South and racial discrimination, they're bringing that too.
It's very present.
Yes. And I don't want to make it seem like this is a split between North and South, because there was prejudice among Northern whites as well. So it's kind of complex, but you have these various regional influences that are meeting up here in St. Louis, and so you have a very important progressive reform community here that begins to closely look at, again, what is available to the African American community. Where are they being discriminated, against in St. Louis? So they do these surveys. They study the schools, they study the hospitals, they study the libraries, and they're doing this work quietly, as they said. Right now, I'm thinking about the organization, which was a committee that actually formed the genesis for the St. Louis Urban League. So there was a committee of 15 reformers, 5 whites from what was called a social service agency, 5 African-American men from a black businessmen's organization called the Forum Club, and then 5 African-American women who were members of the Colored Women's Club. And they formed an organization called the St. Louis Committee for Social Service among Colored People. And this, as I just explained, was an interracial committee. And there were other committees in other major cities like this committee.
And was this before the East St. Louis race riots?
Yes,
Okay.
and it butts
Okay.
up against
Okay.
the East St. Louis race riot, because this group that I'm talking about, they began their work in like 1910, 1911. And then in 1917, 1918, they have disbanded, but some of their members become some of the founding members of the St. Louis Urban League here. And again, we see this not only in St. Louis,
but around the country.
We see it in other major cities. And one thing to consider in terms of the size of the Black population and the impact of the migration on the size. In 1920, St. Louis's African American community is the 8th largest Black urban community in the nation. I don't know where
Wow.
those numbers are now,
No,
but I can
we're
tell
not
you,
8.
I'm telling you,
Might
they're
be
not
80.
80. It might be 80. Exactly. And in 1880, rather, the African American population here was the third largest. Only Philadelphia and Baltimore.
And you mentioned that Sumner is I mean, PhD, the teachers at Sumner had PhDs. That is how incredible the education was.
And we have to think about why they did, though.
Well, go ahead.
Part of the reason why they did is because they could not
Right.
work at other institutions,
Right.
you know. So that was part of the constraints of racial segregation.
And I bring that up when you talk about us being 8th largest, 3rd largest at various points in time. The things that were attractive here,
Absolutely.
the things that were working,
Absolutely.
if you will, here. Sumner was one of those, and Homer G was another that brought African Americans to St. Louis, and we are talking about these things in part because of this documentary that Dr. Henry Louis Gates has done. It's on and is on PBS. But also because of where we are today and how we got to this point today from such a celebrated past, such a historic, so many historic points along the way that were much more, there was much more success, even though it was a very difficult, still a very difficult time.
Absolutely. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the diversity within the African American migrant community.
And to explain
because we often think primarily about the Black Southern migrants who were coming from that sharecropping, extremely oppressive agricultural environment to St. Louis. But during the Great Migration, there were also African American migrants that came from all over. When you talk about what's attracting them, I'm thinking about, for example, John T. Clark, who was the executive secretary of the St. Louis Urban League from 1926 to 1948. And he was born in Louisville, Kentucky. Among other places, when he started his Urban League career, he fathered the Pittsburgh League, and he was there until 1918. He worked and had a leadership role in the Harlem, New York office. And so when he migrated to St. Louis, he migrated from Pittsburgh.
Oh.
He was in New York. He was Louisville, and then he had
it was the work that was moving him.
It was the work that was moving him. And then you have some of the teachers who come during that time, and her last name escapes me right now, Dr. Ruth. If you look on my notes, you might see. See.
I've got her book and I've got her notes.
I think I wrote her name down, but she became the principal.
Harris.
Yes, Ruth Harris, Dr. Ruth Harris.
I don't even have my glasses on, and I could read that.
And my writing, my
no,
little
you have
scribble,
beautiful handwriting.
my scribble there.
So she too.
She came during that period, and there were a lot of African American professional class.
That was such an important point because some of the photos we see, of course, in video of the Great Migration where it exists. Again, people are dressed up, but everybody's not. And you imagine them leaving the violence of the South, the oppression of the South, with what they could put in a suitcase with little or nothing coming out of agriculture, as you mentioned it. But your point is that it's not just people coming out of sharecropping. There are
Absolutely.
professionals that are migrating.
Absolutely. And something else to consider about John T. Clark's migration to St. Louis. He was familiar with St. Louis before he arrived, but it was that bond issue in 1922, that 80-something million dollar, I think it was like $87 million bond issue, where $1.2 million of that bond issue was earmarked for the new Negro Hospital, which became, of course, Homer G. Phillips. And he said that was one of the major things that made him say, okay,
I'll come to St. Louis. Yeah.
I'll go to St. Louis and accept this job, because what this represents, on the one hand, is a voting population. First of all, a segregated city, yes, but a voting population that is willing to put more money into segregated institutions, transmuting segregation into power,
Furthering professional
the manipulation
development,
of
right?
public culture. And so he's looking at this as an opportunity, not only for himself as the new executive secretary of the Urban League, but he's looking at it as an opportunity for community organizing and African American community advancement.
We're watching around the country. Now we're into the 30s, Great Depression, but there is a labor movement that takes place as well. And that's about all over the country, but with defense jobs. And there is a battle and pushback and protest to say Black people deserve these jobs as well. What's the impact of those times on St. Louis, on African Americans in St. Louis?
Well, as you know, I mean, and this is not just St. Louis. When we look at the impact of World War I,
right,
and the impact of World War II on the Great Migration and on, what you just described, of course, the soldiers are coming back, and they're different. They're different in a number of ways. But when we talk about World War II, in particular, Black soldiers are coming home to, in St. Louis, for example, a segregated city. But by the 1940s, you can observe a shift, and it had started really in the 1930s. So, for example, whereas during the progressive era, and I explained some of that strategy of interracial reformers, and as time goes on in the 20s and in the 30s, you still can witness this strategy coming from the Urban League and those who are aligned with this strategy of depending on the goodwill of white people to want to share resources, to want change, progressive change that will impact the African American community. And so when African American leadership in the Urban League are meeting with employers during this period, they're trying to get jobs, obviously, for African Americans in these industries, in local neighborhood businesses, for example.
And are they boosted or hurt by A. Philip Randolph's work as a labor organizer?
I think in some ways they're boosted.
Yeah.
These things are happening simultaneously.
Right.
The labor situation here is really a hard nut to crack. during that period and even since that period. You know, when Homer G. Phillips Hospital was under construction, white laborers, construction workers walked off the job when African American skilled laborers were brought on the job. You know, and so there was a great deal of fiction. So when I talk about these labor issues here, I'm not even primarily talking about organized labor when I talk about what the Urban League was able to do, because this was one of the criticisms of this younger generation that has emerged and is emerging by the 1930s. When we think about an organization that's representative of this in St. Louis, the Colored Clerks Circle in St. Louis, and they emerge in the 1930s. And of course, not only in St. Louis, but we see in some other urban and rural areas in the country, this is a time when there is significant communist organizing. And interestingly, because there were very few majority organizations that were taking up the cause of African Americans, the communists were. When we see, you know, the example as in the Scottsboro Boys and how they organized on behalf of the Scottsboro Boys who were wrongly accused of raping a white woman.
And we do mean boys. They were 9, 10, 11 years old.
We do mean boys. And so, you know, this labor question, it's complex, but going back to this shift that we're seeing. So the progressive era interracial organizers and those organizers who are emerging in the 1920s, and I should say who are continuing in the 1920s and in the 1930s, that the Urban League, St. Louis Urban League, and the Urban League movement nationwide represents so well. Their form of activism is negotiation. So if we're going to try to gain positions for African Americans in industries, in white businesses that are actually in Black communities, some of whom actually moved into those communities during this period of the Great Migration, especially during the 20s and 30s, because the racial demographics of those neighborhoods had changed, and they've become Black now, and some of those white-owned businesses had actually moved into those neighborhoods during those periods. And so the Urban League is going to these employers and asking them to hire
You can't just
Blacks.
make money off of us. You need to hire us.
Right.
Yeah.
And notice I said asking them.
Yeah. It wasn't.
They're asking them. And they are depending on the goodwill of these employers. And in many cases, the response that they got was, you know, we can't find any qualified, any good.
Which we continue to hear.
And so the Urban League says, well, we'll find some for you, you know. And so that approach was very limited. And so this
in its effect?
Absolutely. Yeah. And what the Urban League was able to do in terms of the success that it had employing Black people was in the service industries. So when we see how the Urban League was successful at placing African American women in white homes as domestic workers, it got to the point where Urban League officials were actually kind of proud of that and bragging about it because they had done so well. And so we understand why they had done so well, because this was an area, the service industry was the area where African Americans were relegated to.
Right.
So you didn't really have to push.
And so, given that, because as you're talking, I'm thinking of the documentary and how Detroit boomed and how parts of California boomed because of the industries. How Portland and Seattle boomed because of the industries, and then Harlem. Entertainment is taking hold. The cultural renaissance, the thought leaders are there. It's booming for that reason. St. Louis, it seems, although people are getting decent jobs, it's not booming.
Well, it's when you talk about the booming in those areas like Detroit, you have to think about the industries.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Right. Right.
Or booming.
Yes.
You know.
Right.
And as you were talking, I was thinking about how it was the cultural scene here too that was attracting African American migrants as well, because there was a thriving cultural scene
Music
here. Yes. And I'm thinking about a migrant that I read about who came here in the 1930s, and she was an educator, and that was one of the things that she pointed out when she was interviewed about, why she was attracted to St. Louis. She said that it was the culture. It was, and when I say culture, I'm not just talking about the arts, although that was a part of it, the music, and what have you. But it was the social life. She said it was the social life.
I thought I read that the social clubs, there were so many in St. Louis.
Yes, and so when you talk about St. Louis as a city during this first half of the 20th century, during the Great Migration, where you have entrenched, institutionalized racial segregation, you also have a city where African Americans are able to socialize and move about more freely than they have been in the South, and even in some other urban areas.
I have interviewed seniors who talk about their parents, so they would have experienced the Great Migration, and certainly in East St. Louis, who talk about, I never had to leave because I had everything I needed. I remember one woman telling me, we had a drugstore, we had a movie theater, we had restaurants, we had a bank, we had it all on our side of town, if you will.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I was thinking about earlier when you mentioned Homer G. Phillips and it being a center of excellence. There's a tendency sometimes among some to look back, and they're thinking about the cohesiveness.
Am I romanticizing some parts of it?
I think
and that's okay.
We tend to.
We tend
sometimes.
to. All of us, no matter your background.
What racial segregation created was a cohesiveness because of the structure
and necessity
that it imposed.
Right.
It imposed a structure.
Yeah.
So in St. Louis, for example, you could not live anywhere you wanted to live.
Right.
And so part of the impact of the Great Migration, we see it showing up in the race restrictive covenants that began appearing in that first decade, that second decade of the 20th century. That's not just random. That's in direct response to African American migrants moving into St. Louis. In some cases, I remember in 1921, 1922 in the newspapers, I saw where in 1 week, 1,000 African Americans had moved into the city of St. Louis from outside of Missouri. That's a lot of people coming into a city that is segregated, and they have to have housing.
Right. And as you pointed out earlier, so everybody isn't a domestic. There is a growing lower middle class, if you will, middle class, and those African Americans, those Black families want better housing. And I did not know, and this is what's great about any documentary, is that you learn something. And I of course, I know who Hattie McDaniel is, and I've seen Gone with the Wind, and I saw her Oscar speech, being the first Black woman to win an Oscar for her role in Gone with the Wind. I did not know that she sued and was sued. They tried to evict her from her house when she moved in California, a white community. So we see that same thing. That's 1945, the West Adams case. We see that same issue happening all across the country, where white organizations are suing to evict and creating racial covenants. You cannot sell this house to a Black person, and Black people do somehow move in. And so we have this Supreme Court case. We're now in 1948.
Yeah. And so you have to keep in mind that, as I said, St. Louis voters are actually the first to pass a race restrictive covenant ordinance by vote. By the legislatures had done it in other cities. These are the voters who are passing this race restrictive ordinance in 1916. Now, it doesn't last long enough to even go into effect. It was struck down in 1917. But you still have these race restrictive covenant agreements that are proliferating throughout that first half of the 20th century. From 1910 to 1948, for example, in St. Louis, there were close to 350 individual covenant agreements that are established. And so that helps us to understand how segregation is structurally
is entrenched.
It is entrenched. And what you just described about African Americans having to sue, for example, when they want to buy a home. This is just one example of the indignities that African Americans of all social classes had to contend with. And that's part of the reason why we cannot romanticize this period. I've said to my students when they don't say this anymore, but at one point in my teaching career, I would have students who would say, "Oh, African Americans were better off during that period, during segregation," until they really get into the history and they see. And I said, well, if they were better off, why do we have a civil rights movement? What did they fight for? What did they die for?
What were the conditions
if it was so good?
Yeah.
Why did they fight to change it? So yeah, it's complex.
And in your mind, and as a history professor and author, what is it that we don't understand about the Great Migration? Because it seems we do. In a way, we do romanticize it. And the photos are out there that help us to romanticize it.
Well, one of the things that, I think about this a lot over time, and there's certain periods, in my career where I've thought about it more than others. And in our current times, I'm thinking about it a lot now.
Yeah.
When you look at the Black freedom struggle in the United States, and when I say Black freedom struggle, that encompasses the modern civil rights movement, but it's not synonymous with it. The modern civil rights movement was a part of the Black freedom struggle. We can locate the origins of the Black freedom struggle at the embarkation of on the slave ships, okay, when African Americans first resisted the slave trade and coming here to be slaves. And then we can come all the way up to the present and look at this entire period as a Black freedom struggle. Throughout this Black freedom struggle, you have seen the nature of the struggle, the details of the struggle to be different. We're no longer in a period of slavery. We're no longer in a period of Jim Crow segregation. But if you were to ask if African Americans are able to enjoy the full citizenship rights that the Constitution guaranteed them in the mid-19th century, we'd have to say, well, there's some evidence
that the answer is no.
The answer is no. When we look, for example, at the cases of police brutality, this issue of police brutality and
prison rates
and prison
cancer
rates. Yeah. So this is an ongoing struggle to not only for African American progress, so to speak, but this is an ongoing fight, an ongoing movement to get America to live up to its democratic ideals. And this is something that we as American people have had to do since the founding. And we're still engaged in it. So when we look at various periods of history, that struggle, that Black freedom struggle, is always present. But it does not mean that African American life is fully consumed by the constraints of that struggle. And this is why we can, as we're talking about, what attracted to African Americans to St. Louis, and we talk about the social scene, the culture, and all of that. I mean, these are things that give us insight into how African Americans experience life daily. And it wasn't that they weren't aware and did not have to deal
or weren't
with the,
mad about
the ugliness of racial segregation, but their lives weren't totally consumed by it.
They weren't then and they aren't now. And that's a something out of nothing
absolutely
mentality, if you will. And we do have to, again, we talked about Hattie McDaniel's case and racial covenants, but the importance of this St. Louis case to the nation, really.
Absolutely. And now we're talking about Shelley versus Kramer in 1948. When we look at, within St. Louis, when we look at the in-migration among the African American community and where African Americans move to with the lifting of the race restrictive covenants vis-a-vis the Shelley v. Kramer case in 1948, they're now able to move into areas of the city and of the suburbs where they had not been able to move. And so while, we may, as you say, romanticize the history of the Ville neighborhood, when you had all of these historically Black institutions all at once, and this tight knit African American middle class and stable working class thriving there during that period, you have to keep in mind that they also understood this is where I have to live.
Right.
This is the best that I can do not because of my income, not because I haven't saved.
Or my intellect or my ability.
Ability. But I have to live in this community as much as I love it because my race
They won't let me.
won't let me move into another neighborhood, get a bigger house. It took a long time for me to figure out why the Ville neighborhood, why white St. Louisans who had lived there in the 19th century, and now we see as the impact of the Great Migration takes hold, they don't put up a fight for that neighborhood. They don't put up a fight for the Ville community. And, you know, as a historian, I had to ask why. And it took a long time for me to
What did you
answer
come
that.
to?
I came to what I see as involving the housing stock in that neighborhood. These were largely smaller frame homes. There were some brick homes there, but it's really as you get on the outskirts of the Ville proper where you start seeing the larger brick homes. And so white Ellertsville residents did not put up a fight
Because
they could move out of the Ville and move into other neighborhood nicer in terms of the housing stock, larger, more space around the homes. And so, you know, it was that constraint really that actually helps to create this thriving African American community
because
in the
whites
Ville.
gave it up so readily.
Because whites gave it up so readily. But just as people in the larger population, you have diversity of desires in terms of where you want to live, what types of homes you want to live in, how much yard space you want, how you don't, you know, if you don't
How
want
close you want your neighbors or not, right?
Absolutely, African Americans are no different than that. And so with the Shelley case, they began moving westward. They had already moved westward from downtown. The earliest of those migrants who were poor, who were socioeconomically among the poorest, they moved into downtown on the riverfront, along with poor
Whites.
European migrants who moved there. And when those migrants became, you know, upwardly mobile enough to move out of that area, they moved west. And so you have this continuing westward movement that's going on here in St. Louis and the region. And so with the Shelley case, you have African Americans beginning to move into suburbs like like University City and other areas in North County.
The documentary will also, I have two more questions in it that may be a lie, I might have five, but at least two. The documentary also, and we've heard demographers, talk about this, the reverse migration that has occurred, of Atlanta being the one place. And my mother used to marvel. She would say, "We worked so hard to get out of the South. I can't believe y'all are going back."
Yeah.
My mother said she never wanted to return to Mississippi, even in a casket.
Yeah.
Hated it that much.
And it was because of her experience.
Right.
And so that's one thing we have to keep in mind is that each generation has a different experience. I think about this a lot with my grandchildren. I have 3 grandchildren.
The reverse migration.
Well, they're kids. They're 12.
Okay.
The middle child will be 10 this month and 7. And they were born post-Obama. Kevin, the oldest, was born when President Obama was president. Their generation will not have the collective memory
Right.
of their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation. Now, they're going to have something to deal with.
They've got something to deal with.
They've got something to deal with.
Pandemic babies. They've got something to deal with.
They've got something to deal with. And it'll be interesting to hear their experiences and their stories 20 and 40
But they don't
years
have any frame of reference for the South, is what you're saying.
They don't have any frame of reference
But
for
when
that
my-
oppressive South.
When my mother's making these comments, I'm in my 60s now, and I wasn't even married. I was in my 20s. And so she's questioning, why are so many Black people returning to the South? This is happening in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. Well, the South has changed.
Right.
And it's not that there's not still racial prejudice there as it
Right.
is all over this country. And so, you know, it's what each generation and now these younger generations, and this has been going on, what you're talking about now has been going on for a while. It's what they are identifying
Right.
in these southern cities.
Right.
And when you talk about Atlanta, of course, you know, you have the history of the economic boom
Yeah.
there, but you also have the social scene there. And, you know, that's part of, I don't know if it was explicit in what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about Black migrants having family or friends,
Right.
you know, in these places. But what also attracted them was seeing a large, thriving Black community.
Right. And that
And
certainly
that's-
is the case
with
in
Atlanta.
Mhm,
And you're seeing that in some other southern
Absolutely.
cities
Absolutely.
now. You know, so as you say, they don't have that collective memory, that collective experience with the South that our parents'
At all.
generation
At all.
had.
At
No.
all. Well, I want to ask you this one last question that we are asking all of our guests this season, in season 2 of Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel, and it is a take on the title of the show, Listen St. Louis. Professor, who should we be listening to?
That's an interesting question, and I'm going to say give two different answers here. I think we need to be listening to one another. And when I say listening to one another, I'm talking about all of us. All of us in St. Louis, all of us in the United States of America. Because we're not in a period where we're listening to one another. And one of the things that struck me about the progressive era generations of reformers and coming into the 20th century, there was more listening in some ways than I'm seeing now. And again, not romanticizing this. I'm not saying things were better then. But
there was a decorum then that there isn't today.
Well, and there when you have to keep in mind that although the interracial reformers that I have studied, they are operating in a context here in St. Louis that supports racial segregation. But they also see what they're doing, even the establishment of segregated institutions, they see it as undermining racial segregation. So we look at Homer G. Phillips Hospital, for example, and this hospital that's built for Black people, that trained so many Black doctors, almost simultaneously when it opens in 1937, Black doctors are starting to get opportunities in white hospitals and other places. So there's this draw from Homer G. Phillips Hospital almost at the beginning of its opening. And when we come into the 40s, it's even greater because things are changing. Things are starting to open up. And so as one historian who studied this said, this segregated institution actually served to undermine racial segregation and foster segregation. But what it meant was the demise of this hospital that was at one and the same time, yes, a segregated institution, but also a source of pride to the Black community. But back to the answer to that question.
Who should we listen to?
In terms of who we should listen to, we need to listen to one another because we're hearing so much noise that's coming to the forefront. And I don't know if we are doing enough on the ground, things that are not on the national stage, but forming groups, having talks, talking about, these very hard topics. We're going to have to face them. And we're going to have to talk about those things that divide us, that we've allowed to divide us. And I think if we really break those barriers and begin to really talk about our experiences, we'll see that we have more in common.
And we can come up with solutions
and we can
that everyone in the room talking to one another can agree upon.
Yes. And so the other part that I'd like to address in terms of who we should listen to.
One is listen to each other.
Listen to one another.
Okay.
And also listen to those voices in our society that are speaking to what this democracy, this experiment in democracy that is the United States. Listen to what they are saying to us about what this country should be about. Because really, when we say, we often say when we see ugliness, some of the ugliness that we have dealt with recently and that we're dealing with now, when we see some of those things that are not going to foster the values, the ideals
that we supposedly
the founding fathers actually were thinking about and etching into our founding documents, even as many of them were slaves. They were slave holders, rather. But they had this vision of the United States of America being a democracy like no other. And even Thomas Jefferson knew that slavery was not going to last forever. He knew it couldn't. Not if the United States of America was going to live up to its ideals. And so I want to ask us to open ourselves up to listen to those voices that are crying out and saying, you know, my history is not a threat. My history is American history. Right. It's a history that includes you and me.
Right.
And African American history, my history as a woman, and we can just throw in a whole lot of groups, all of us, because we're all immigrants except for the Native Americans. This is what makes us the United States of America. Right. This is what makes us strong. And some of what we're seeing now, the pushback to the progress that we have made, that pushback is, if it does make us stronger, it's going to be because at some point we begin to see that we're better together and that we have to come together.
Great answer to the question. Thank you so much. It's so good to have you back in the studio.
Thank you.
Do you like my new studio?
I do.
I like it too.
I do.
I like it too. Her book is Groping Toward Democracy, African American Social Welfare Reform in St. Louis, 1910 to 1949. Professor Priscilla Dowden-White. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel. That documentary series, by the way, The Great Migration by Professor Henry Louis Gates continues. If you are a Passport member, you have to join and become a Passport member of PBS. You can watch it on the app. So you have to join, become a Passport member, and you'll be able to watch it anytime you want. If you're not doing that, it's on every Tuesday evening on PBS. And for 30 days, you can watch it on the website. That sounds a little complicated, but it's not really. Just become a Passport member of PBS. We thank you so much for joining us for another incredible conversation right here on Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel on 9 PBS.
Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel is supported in part by Midwest Bank Center, the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation, and Orvin and Latrice Kimbrough.